welcome back to Senate Education. So, Andrew, your last name is Proutman?
Yep.
Mr. Proutman. It's great to have you with us. You probably have heard some of our questions, but let's go to the bill. Again, we are looking at the revised copy. This is 2.1 of 303. And we're trying to understand a couple of things. The agency they've drafted this a couple of times, and there's a little confusion. We got one draft, then they came back with changes. We got another draft, and now we're trying to sort of settle some questions that are still outstanding. And the first one, and others please feel to jump in, has to do with the first page. And if you look under mandatory completion of literacy models, we are trying to decide whether or not professionally licensed should be used around people that should receive this. And whether it should include people who are provisionally licensed, emergency licensed, teaching interns, apprentice licenses, those kinds of folks. So let's start there. Tell us your thoughts.
Great. So, for the record, Andrew Proutman, Assistant Director of Education Quality, primarily licensing preparation. So yeah, a couple different pieces within that. To start with that idea of the provisional license, there's definitely pros and cons. I mean, I'm kind of going back and forth on this.
And actually, this might be helpful, and I apologize for perfect. How long can a provisional license last?
Yep.
Okay.
So in a provisional license, when first issued, it's 2 years, and if there are extenuating circumstances, we may, at the request of a superintendent, issue an additional 1 year. So it can be a total of 3.
So you could have a teacher teaching literacy for 3 years and not have to go through this, and I think the committee would be concerned with that.
Right. So I think on that piece, there's that appearance of, what's fair, right? We're asking the professionally licensed teachers, but not this group. Where I was thinking, just on that idea of that implementation, I'm working a lot, especially with special education provisional license holders right now. We've been doing a lot of work to try to recruit people into the field to support them. So we have a whole new cohort, 88, I believe, under that, as well as some additional folks. So the requirements that they're working on right now, they have to take and pass the Praxis 2 for special education, which is not usually required, but for this cohort, we really want to make sure they have to go through separate modules that we use through Vanderbilt University, which is quite a lot of work. That's all within their first 30 days of teaching.
Provisional license.
Yeah, okay, that provisional license. They then will also need to start going through an actual licensure program. We're finding the majority of this cohort are going through Vermont Higher Ed Collaborative, so that's 21 credits. And that's a lot for 2 years, so they're starting to extend into that 3rd year.
Who's paying for that, Jim?
It depends. I think most recently, the tuition reimbursement process, that new forgivable loan program. But then districts are putting money in. There's in most districts, someone on a provisional license would qualify for PD funds. And then depending on sort of that local context and the contract, there may be some additional funds. I think some districts use some of the federal COVID funding as well. So when I think about those folks on provisional licenses, right, they're doing an entire preparation program that sometimes, is 4 years being acted into 2, as well as being first year teachers. So that was sort of my thinking when posing that question of do we really want to include the provisional licenses in there? Because part of our strategy is really looking at them as retainment. We're seeing a pattern where folks are unable to complete all of the requirements. And so then after 2 years, sometimes 3, but usually just 2 years, they're leaving and the school's recruiting someone totally new and starting over. And we know that definitely has some negative impacts. on students. So we're really doing a lot to try to retain them, get them in, and I think with the language of the bill, once they are professionally licensed, they would still have to do the modules within those first 2 years.
Seems to me, but please correct me if I'm wrong, that again, if we're gonna put somebody in elementary school for any time, 46 hours seems like a logical thing to do to make sure that children are learning to read and write properly,
Exactly.
whether provisional, emergency, whatever.
Right, so, I mean, what I was speaking about, that's 88 people, we
Yeah.
have almost 900 provisional and emergency licenses this school year.
Okay.
Just issued, that's not including folks on the second or.
So are you agreeing that we should move in this direction with the provisional requiring this 46 hours for teachers?
Yeah, I think in that whole context, especially if we're thinking about elementary ed teachers and stuff, that could make sense. And this could get, just moving ahead a little bit, into some of that nuance when we start thinking about that implementation and different endorsements, where it would and would not be appropriate as well.
Thank you. It's nice having you here. I feel like we should have had you here earlier. So yeah, this is great, but wanted to say that I think my personal opinion is I feel like we should move pretty slowly on this. It seems like it's important and it's gonna have big impacts on not just our kids and their reading, but on the, on teachers. So I just want to make sure we get this right. I also was gonna say that, what was I gonna say? Something about teachers and.
Provisional, emergency.
Yep, wow, okay, that just is gone. That's embarrassing. It'll come back and
Okay.
then I'll try
So
back in
yes.
again.
So just a kind of a curiosity question, do you or Ted see any complications with the language in here? Inadvertently rolling in unanticipated educators, such as driver's training, CDL schools, I don't know, you name it. I mean, there's all kinds of educational universities, as an example. How do we, is the language clear enough that what we're really talking about is, K to 12 type institutions as opposed to the full universe of people who provide training and education in the state?
Yeah, I think that's getting into that section 3.
Yeah, for the record, again, Ted Fisher from the Agency of Education. There are some limits. We're not talking about university professors who really just be the
Yeah,
K-12
I'm talking, I know what your intent is.
Right.
That's clear, but is the language sufficient to kind of put boundaries around, okay, Bennington College, 46 hours, see you when you're done.
I think that I could be wrong, but that's when we talked about professionally licensed. I think that would limit the post-secondary education folks. But
I think we're struggling. We at AOE are struggling as is the committee with the question of some of the breadth of this. And you heard me advocate for administrators being included here, but the way you have it currently drafted in 2.1, it's because I'm very just hearing from my colleague about the cohort for special education students understanding, or special education teachers understanding that's an area of high need. It's an area where they have lots of requirements that they need to learn. They still should know literacy, but we're also concerned about recruitment and retention and the burden of things we're putting on them. And that's an area of high interest for us statewide. So I think we're grappling with that same end, but I'm also very receptive to Senator Gulick's point about wanting to move slowly, which is I think why we kind of fall down on the professionally licensed definition, because it allows for some remembering. Yes, there is a potential that it could take 3 years to go through the full process. They're still going to be a licensed educator and they're still going to be subject to this. There's no reason why they couldn't do it.
Hours, and I'm wondering also if you would help me with this. It seems to me that we are running a risk of not teaching kids the right way if you have a provisional license for even 2 years.
That's exactly the counter argument we're struggling with, and that's why our
Okay.
original proposed
Yeah.
version had
Senator,
educators.
and that's Senator Reed.
Right.
As the definition.
I remember what I was gonna say. This is good. This is good, okay? I was going to mention the concept of coaches, because I know there are schools that have reading coaches and have all kinds of various coaches who are there for professional development, so I am thinking again, and like thinking of moving slowly, if you do have a teacher who, or a provisional licensed teacher who's in a school who might not have the time or the wherewithal, or is, really overwhelmed in those early years, might not be able to complete the modules, and I don't know what the coaching landscape looks like exactly, but it would be interesting to know if they had supports within the school to help them with the reading and with making sure that their reading instruction practices were
To ask,
based in science.
with, through you, Mr. Chair, to ask just a clarifying question, do you mean potentially adding another section or another subsection that would require that individuals who are going through that process be working in concert or in collaboration with someone who is I don't know the right term, coach or, highly skilled literacy, or someone who's highly skilled in reading? What do you think
I
about
was gonna, well, I was
Yeah,
gonna
go
say,
for
I'm
it.
not, shouldn't answer that question, because I don't know enough yet, but it's something to think about.
Yeah,
And if I may, I just. Sometimes I make this analogy, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but would we ever say to a nurse, you don't need to learn this bit? While with your provisional, even though you may see patients, I mean, the damage to me, we have a huge literacy issue in this state. And a provisional teacher can be in the classroom for 3 years teaching reading and writing at 3rd grade. It doesn't work for me, but maybe I'm missing something, please.
yeah, no, I certainly agree. That's kind of what I keep going back and forth on. Especially thinking about elementary education, I think it's like 124 provisionals in that we've issued this year. For elementary ed, which is also now, we're still working through some of the data, that it looks like it may now be a shortage area for our state, as well as other states, which is new context for our country. So in that, absolutely, I think that in that cohort, something like this would be a really valuable resource for them. And yeah, in that context, I would certainly agree. There are also situations, one thing that we've been seeing is that a lot of the people who are working on provisionals, and I don't have like a good percentage or data point, but anecdotally at least, it's a lot of individuals that I've been supporting who have gone through a preparation program and just didn't pass the testing, or they were unable to do their student teaching because, illness in the family or something like that. And they've been working in schools for the past 10 years. And now, since they've never really been considered for a licensed teaching position, with the shortages, they're being considered, they're getting put on provisional licenses, and they're doing very good work and really showing that commitment working in our schools and in a licensed position. So there are lots of really, really good, not professionally licensed, but still qualified individuals who are working in those positions.
Maybe, yeah, please.
So again, I'm still kind of wrapped around the whole professional licensing part of the definition. And I was just thinking that, professional licensing for educators in fields outside of AOE's purview, that's kind of, that's kind of the caution then. I thought of a couple more just sitting here, pilot training, SCUBA as an example, they're professionally licensed. I'm just wondering if we need to, again, put boundaries around this so that you protect, and I agree, I understand and agree with the premise of the bill. I just don't want to start scraping in people who unintended, affect them on unintention.
So let's say, James, if I may ask you, would somebody who is, as Senator Weeks points out, it's important that we're not looking to pull in people who are school instructors, people, that group of people, if you will, just as an example. Could they, with this language, be pulled in?
No,
Okay,
occupational licensing spans, occupational licensing is for occupations.
yeah,
And then there's licenses required for a myriad of things that we all participate in society.
Yeah.
When we're looking at trying to figure out what law applies to what group, we're orienting ourselves to where the law is located. So for this example, big picture, Title 16 educational link. And then we go, the next level would be the chapter. And this, I forget the title of the chapter, but chapter 51 is licensing of teachers. And then this specific definition in draft 2.1, we're talking about educator licenses specifically. So I would say there's multiple layers that would exclude everyone that you brought up automatically without having to make an amendment to this. Does that make sense?
Fine. I just,
He just wants, he raised it as a precautionary thing, we just want to make sure.
yeah, I'm not trying to change anything, so.
Senator Keel, please.
Adult ed. Are they licensed educators?
No, but we do have a license for director of adult ed in CTE centers, but the instructors themselves are not licensed.
Okay, interesting. Okay, should do the modules, but
Could you define the difference between emergency and provisional for us?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yep, so an emergency license is, someone has a bachelor's degree. And the school has not been able to hire an otherwise qualified educator. Provisional license, there's a couple of different dates. If they hold, an expired or valid license from Vermont or another state, they would qualify. If they have, at least 18 credits in the content area, 21 for special ed. And then, or if they've passed the practice to content test, if there's one for that content area. And there's less limitations on the district, like they could hire someone if there is, an otherwise strong candidate.
And how long does an emergency license last?
Just one school year.
It's just that once.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, and then teaching interns and apprenticeship licenses, again, we're trying to see who we really want to pull into this.
Yeah, so we wouldn't have that. I think that language, it seems to come a little bit from our general definition that encompasses other states as well. So we don't have any licenses for teaching interns. Apprenticeship licenses is specifically talking about CTE centers, so that's like a whole nother can of worms.
So it's an interesting thing. So is another term for teaching intern, student teacher? Okay,
Yeah, and I think that would be captured in some of the work on ROPA, which gets into that question earlier around our metrics and our assessment is, what I would envision is that our teacher prep programs would either use these modules or adapt their current, like, I'm sure a few, like when I went through UVM, I had a reading course, even though I was secondary social studies, right?
Yeah.
So there can already be an alignment in there. And we could get to a point where they're meeting this requirement during their pre-service education.
so committee, I think the question for all of us is, who else do we want to capture in this? Do we want provisional? Do we want emergency? Do we want student teachers? To go through this 46-hour training, get sign off on it. I mean, my gut, at the very least, personally, but provisional seems to me to kind of have them go through it. And I also do worry about the emergency if you're teaching second grade for a year. But I also, Shima, that's Senator Keel.
How long again do folks normally have an emergency license?
It's just one school year. Yeah.
Yes, Senator Keel.
I'm sorry,
No,
sure.
no, please.
Aren't second grade teachers in their endorsement learning how to teach reading and face and science? I mean, isn't that part of their training
Through the preparation programs?
yeah,
Yeah, I can't remember exactly. We've done a couple different reviews and there's a couple different organizations that do. And generally the way that we like rank on those, I'm not super thrilled on when they get letter grades, but through our standards, there are a lot of the phonetics and all those components that are in our standards and are at least addressed, I believe, in all of our preparation programs. Some of them will have it, addressed and they kind of move on. Other ones do a really, really good job. So it depends on the individual program.
And just to be clear, are these modules gonna be mandatory for everyone regardless of how much literacy training they have? Yeah, okay.
To clarify, we asked in our last round, there would be the possibility that, so the language in section 2 now says, and I'm quoting from memory, so it's something along the lines of the modules adopted by the agency or selected by the agency or approved other ones. So we could, in reference to someone who's a highly trained literacy specialist with years of experience, they would have some professional learning in their past that would meet our standard. If you would permit me, Mr. Chair, I think we're leaning into, to your point a moment ago, we're leaning into some concern, and Andrew can please kick me under the tail if I'm saying anything wrong. But it's important to note that provisional and emergency licensure are things that get undertaken when we cannot fill a candidate, or in certain other cases where you maybe have someone who's an educator from another state who needs to go through the licensing process. But we are hoping that everyone is meeting as soon as possible that high standard. And I just wanted to sort of acknowledge that fact. As you all know, we are in an employment crisis,
Right.
and unfortunately, so we do struggle with that. I think we also struggle with that same concern you had, Mr. Chair, about that. We're trying to figure out how to navigate the moment that we're in the hopes that we get to a point where everyone's getting this as soon as possible.
Right, and I think this committee doesn't want to look at 5 years and say, geez,
Right.
we're in an employment crisis, otherwise our test scores would be better.
That's a good point. Absolutely.
So, okay. So committee, what would you like to do? I think the choices are, what do we want to do around provisional? Now, to your point, I think it's a good one. If somebody does come in second grade and they have some kind of credential that they can get signed off on, like, okay, Mike has this, he's good, but if he doesn't have it, then it seems to me that gotta look through this 46 hours.
Do we have to decide right now? Can I have some time to think about it?
Would somebody turn the clock, what is it, the hourglass? Yes, well, you can absolutely have time to think about it. I just, love to start to close I'm not trying to put this soft pressure, this is soft pressure.
Right.
Please.
Yeah, I do think, a provisional license, should probably go through this program. But, with the emergency license, if the option is no teacher at all versus an emergency licensed teacher who may not have the module training, I'd rather go with the emergency licensed teacher who doesn't have the module rather than nobody at all for that classroom.
Yeah.
My assumption, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you're provisionally licensed, the intent is there's a runway to it that ends, and then you're licensed and you either fail or you pass. So I think doesn't that kind of scoop in that requirement? It kind of recognizes that provisional is a temporary state and leads to a fully licensed educator.
Yeah, I think that's what we're really working towards right now. Vermont hasn't historically had the same shortage issues as other states. So provisional licenses, we used to do like 300 a year, right? So we're almost triple that.
Okay, that's a number though, but it's like year to year, that 300 then becomes 50, then becomes 10, then, you know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
like that same cohort as it moves through time, eventually I would assume leads to fully licensed.
Right.
Then it falls into the other category that they're in training, right?
Yeah.
They're new to the field.
Right. I think the issue that we're experiencing right now is that there are so many people on that. We don't have the infrastructure at this time to really get them licensed within that time, right? There are only a certain number of seats. So that's what a lot of the work that we've been doing to really support utilizing our peer review program, really working with our ed prep programs to develop a lot of flexibility. They've really stepped up over the past few years with the pandemic. Programs that used to not work with people on provisional licenses have been over the past several years. So we're still really trying to figure out how to really track the data, but we want to see a higher percentage of people on the provisional license get that, that professional license at the end.
That's a good last point, because Andrew mentioned earlier, they either become a professionally fully licensed educator, or there's attrition and they drop out, and the school is back to trying to hire, sometimes hiring another provisional emergency license.
So because a provisional license has a window of, it ends at a certain point.
It can be, it could also just be naturally, it's not a good fit, and so the person decides not to, or it could just be they're covering for a family leave for a few months, right? And then even though they have a 2-year provisional, they only work for 5 months or whatever.
But we are concerned, correct me if I'm wrong, about there are lots of requirements on them in terms of moving towards the license. So we're talking about adding another thing to a pile that could lead to attrition in terms of making it through the program.
Mr. Fannin, what do you think? Provisional licensing for teachers,
So that
do we have, and this is the 46-hour question.
right. I have 46 hours in which case, so I'll answer. For the record, Jeff Van, Vermont NEA. I think that, one of the things we have to make note of is, Senator Weeks sort of was getting at, I was thinking, is that there's two types of folks on provisional licenses. Those people who don't have a license
Yes.
in any other way. And I've got a board member, for example, right now, who's been teaching for more than 20 years, who by virtue of her new assignment in 7th grade,
Okay.
only had a K6 endorsement, had to go through peer review to get, because she's now on a provisional license, she had to go through peer review, and
I see.
Andrew understands it. So she's been at this for 20 plus years. She's a seasoned professional.
Yeah.
Do you want to scoop up people such as her who have been, by virtue of the shortage, has been asked to teach in an area now that she's not endorsed in? And so that's a question for you that you probably need to grapple with.
But, correct me if I'm wrong, we want all teachers to go through this.
Yes.
So he or she may be scooped up no matter what.
Correct. I think
Okay.
the way it's written now,
Right.
that's correct.
Right.
The other piece is the ROPA, the programs who are preparing teachers,
Yeah.
to be teachers.
Yeah,
My understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, that there used to be, as you noted, a requirement that everybody get some literacy instruction, whether you were teaching, aiming for a high school assignment or first, elementary school.
Yeah.
I believe that's been eliminated, or not eliminated, but it's non-requirement in many school professional programs now. And I think that's something that I think you're grappling with here as well. I think that's an important distinction. That's been going on for some years, and we're maybe seeing results of that.
just a reminder, the reason we started this 2 years ago is because we had teachers come before us saying they did not know how to teach reading and writing. So that's why we're continuing this direction. Licensing administrators, Andrew, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that the point was made earlier, if somebody's evaluating a teacher. So I personally do think it would be important for at least the building administrators to participate in this.
So would we write it that way? If you are evaluating a teacher who is teaching literacy, or do you think all building administrators? Actually, I'm looking at it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure on specific language. I think this might get in that, probably not gonna like this answer, I apologize in advance, like, some of this might be part of that, like, interpretation and implementation. Once we start engaging in stakeholders, I'd really like to be able to have some flexibility on those determinations, right? What it looks like in one district may look different in another. Right, so, and I think, again, that's kind of getting into that section 3 piece, but having that ability to really engage with stakeholders, look at each individual endorsement to kind of one at a time, make those decisions with lots of input in the process.
Ben, what do you think of that? Would it help your teachers if principals go through this as sort of a, not only in terms of the evaluation process going into a classroom, but kind of the all hands on deck a little bit? Or do you think principals need it?
Well, I want to speak first, Jay.
No, I know that,
they're
yeah, I'm thinking-
overburdened.
yeah.
I think what you're asking is, do I think it's important that
Does it
from a
enhance?
teacher's perspective, that a principal knows something about which they're evaluating me on as a teacher? And I think the answer is yes.
Any other thoughts on this? Yeah, please, Senator Buick.
My only other thought is that we be very mindful of the timing. The word overburden just came up and it's just true. They are overburdened. So if we can somehow roll it out, I know the clock is ticking and so on, but like first do no harm, right? Let's try not to harm folks.
Particularly kids.
Well, then let's put in here, you can't teach the 3 queuing method, or, like we could explicitly call out some ways of teaching reading that just simply don't work and actually could cause harm. So if we want to get explicit, we could, but I'm just saying, I want to be mindful of retaining the teachers we have and possibly even welcoming new ones without scaring them away or turning them away.
I did just want to signpost that we were mindful of this when we were doing the drafting, so we have some deadlines. I was actually scrolling to the bottom looking for effective dates, but they are actually in the provisions on ROPA and then the provision on licensing. So we have we have a July 1 deadline to submit recommendations to the VSBPE, and then VSBPE has a July 1 deadline. We have a July 1 deadline of 25 to submit recommendations to the VSBPE. July 1. So we're talking about, because the way we think now, we learned a lot of good lessons from some of the language or the bills we worked on last year. Y'all will pass this sometime April, May, it'll go to the governor. By the time it gets through the whole process, we get a July 1. So that gives us a year from effective date of passage, approximately, to get those recommendations to the standards board. The standards board then has a year as part of their rulemaking process, which happens
every 2 years,
Yeah.
regularly.
so as part of their upcoming rulemaking process. That when Andrew and I were both working on this section, we coordinated on that. So it'd be July 1 of 26, they would consider. So that's for ROPA in section 4. Section 2, we have honor before January 1 of 26. So that would give, let's say again, from time of passage, that would give 18 months for Vermont educators to do the modules, to complete these modules. And then, but then we would have, we have a honor before January 1 of 2025, all newly licensed Vermont educators employed. So those are for people who are coming into the profession post passage of the bill, right? So that would be a requirement for us for licensure starting in January 1st of 2025.
So we're really talking about the licensing year that ends January 30th, right? Like that application, correct?
Yeah, for some folks.
So it would be January 30th, 25.
So everyone would have 18 months to do this work. Can we make it 2 years? And is that,
We could consider, there's the ROPA, we aligned with the ROPA for the standards board to a planned session of rulemaking that is upcoming, and correct me if I'm getting that wrong.
No, I think that what we have for ROPA makes sense. You're speaking specifically 2 years for the individual teachers completing the modules. Yeah,
2 years for 46 hours.
yeah, just to.
Right, I know, I'm just thinking if I'm a parent, I've got a kid. Again, I know we don't wanna lose teachers, but unless I'm saying, I just don't want kids to have to go through a couple of years where they don't, I don't know what's funny about this interview.
So this is not a binary, right? This is not, if we don't pass these modules today, kids are gonna suffer. That's not, I
You know
don't
they're
see
suffering
that.
now.
Okay, I don't see that as reality. Our reading scores are not what they should be. That does not
Not even
equate to
close.
suffering.
I would disagree. I mean, if you are leaving 3rd grade and you cannot read and write at the grade level, that's a huge problem. I mean, we had teachers again in here 2 years ago saying, I don't know what I'm doing. And again, if I'm a parent, I think that is a huge problem, and it does equate to suffering.
It's also a problem to have schools that don't have teachers in them. Like, this is,
Absolutely.
like I said, this is not a
Absolutely.
binary, it's a landscape, and we have to be really thoughtful about how we roll this out.
I agree, and I just would say, if I think we've got to put kids first all the way through this, and the risk of kids going through 2 or 3 years of being, as we're saying, not taught properly, that is, I think that's huge, but perhaps I'm wrong. Yes, please.
I'm with you. I think 18 months theoretically is sufficient, but I think we do need to hear some testimony about what is the other professional development load on the teachers. Just to understand. I mean, look, they could say in that 18 months, well, I've got a requirement to do X number of hours per year. I don't have anything else I have to do. Obviously, now I'll do this training. Or the different scenario, holy cow, I've already got 60 hours of professional training requirement for this next 18 months. And how do I accomplish this? I don't understand the landscape of the teachers themselves and what their professional development is to be able to gauge whether 18 months or 24 months or more is appropriate. I think we need to hear at least one testimony.
Ted, you agree?
I would just say, like, we, the agency, agree with all three perspectives that we've heard here, which is that we were very concerned about implementation timelines and enough time for both us and for the field, but we also are feeling the urgency. And so the timelines, we did a much better job than pre-session when we were coming up with some deadlines, and also a more thoughtful job than we did last year when we asked for some effective dates. So there is some thought put into these effective dates. I will actually just take the opportunity, and although Beth and I had talked about this, so we did need to come back to it. In section 3, where we have currently develop and distribute a list of professional learning requirements specific to each licensing endorsement, we as the agency had determined we don't actually need that. Andrew's team is empowered to offer guidance about what under section 2 of this bill as currently contemplated, about what would be appropriate modules for each licensing endorsement that would be an alternative to the AOE's module. So we are on track to do that as of September 1st of this year. We could do that right now. I mean, it would be linked to the bill, but we don't need legislative authority to do that. We would do it as a result of passage under section 2. So we're able to implement that. I checked that timeline with Andrew. He's comfortable with it.
On my to-do list,
And it's on the to-do list. And what I should just say is unusual to some of our legislative conversations. And this is because we have to remember, we did pass a literacy bill a couple of years ago. We have a set of modules that already exist. Educators could go in now pre-passage. We're encouraging them to do so. We're doing work to try to encourage folks to do it. So we do have these resources available. So we do, just to come back full circle, we are cognizant of the need to be careful and provide enough time, but also cognizant of the urgency.
Senator Williams.
I'd like just to get the language out, get that finalized, who's gonna be affected by it. And then let the experts decide the timing that we put these guys.
Other questions before we shift? You guys are staying put, we're just shifting to S204. So as I see it, we need to decide timing, whether or not we're incorporating administrators, whether or not we're talking about provisional licensing, requiring people who are on provisional licenses or not. And I think those are the big, the other thing, while we have you on this topic, has to do with whether or not you look on page 2, line 1, on or before January 1, 2026, should that be all professionally licensed Vermont educators? I guess what we're looking, maybe Beth can help me there. There's something I have flagged, it could be line 5 actually, newly licensed professional, that's St. James.
Beth St. James, Augsburg Legislative Council. So, you've already flagged for yourselves the professionally licensed and the educator decision points.
Right,
That is not settled. You just talked about
right,
that.
right.
On line 5, newly licensed is highlighted because the recommendations that came from the agency use the term professionally in subsection B, but not in subsection C. And so I didn't know if that was a intentional difference or not.
Yeah, do you ask that, would you say that again?
So if you look at line 1,
Yep,
all professionally licensed Vermont educators,
right,
that was a suggestion from AOE.
right,
On line 5, there was no suggestion to insert that word
Got it.
professionally.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing that is just an oversight,
Yeah.
but it also could have been a policy
it
decision.
looks like it's an oversight.
Okay.
The IOEs have confirmed that the intent was educators coming into the profession from the traditional pathways to licensure, but yes, it could apply to both. So newly professionally licensed, just lots of words ending in Y here.
The
Please, yes,
The only other decision point that you haven't brought up here, which may not be appropriate for this folks, but if you're gonna move on, I just wanna flag it, is just. We've got subsection D, which seems to imply that this whole section should apply to licensed educators in public and approved independent schools. And if that is your intent, I would just add some language to make that clear, and if it's not your intent, you'll wanna flesh that out.
you're talking about whether or not it's their intent.
Your,
Well, right,
it's
right,
your
right.
bill.
Right, but you guys drafted, so where are you on this?
It's just the
Sorry, I
term,
just wanna make sure.
the term school head.
Yeah, and then right here is the Vermont Public and Approved Independent Schools that employ the professionally licensed. So, okay, so I think that's the difference is anyone who's required to have a license, so in some schools, special educators are required to be licensed.
Right.
So in that context, yes.
Right.
Okay,
And
so it's through license, basically, is the way to.
I think, I'm sorry, I just, I just lost track there for a second. If we did discuss this briefly previously, which was the idea that if it is not a requirement in some approved independent schools for educators to be licensed, however, you have it, there are licensed educators who work in approved independent schools. And so if you employ a licensed educator, the requirement to keep this follows you, if that makes sense. It follows the licensed educator.
So just for clarity, if you're not a licensed educator, you don't have to do the modules. Period.
That is the intent of the section.
That was well. Right? If we have an emergency, and we need some licensed professionals. So
I'm talking about the ones in approved independent schools who may have been there for 25 years. We're not gonna require them to do the modules.
I think we still have to determine that ourselves. I would leave your position.
You can, that's exactly, you're absolutely right, Mr. Chair and Senator, that is a policy decision. If you wanna require all teachers in Vermont.
Right,
The thing is, from the agency's perspective, we regulate the licensed educators, regardless of where they serve. But the law requires that public schools employ licensed educators, and those same requirements don't apply to all independent schools. So our abilities to track and enforce are different depending on the venue.
Right, but if we're talking about harm to children, I think this is a really important policy decision that we have to make. Because we don't wanna harm some kids and not harm other kids. That doesn't seem to make sense.
and that sounds like that's your position.
we did it with school meals, right?
Right, you know what?
Bifurcated.
That is a decision point for you. Our position is we're sticking to what we know, which is the licensed educators.
Great. Ms. St. James, this is, you asked us, I believe, to print out a version of the Vermont statutes online.
These are just the definitions for the conversation you just had. So, to the extent when you mull over the terms to use when we're talking about educator, administrator, these are the definitions that automatically apply to anything going in this chapter. You can make up your own definitions for each individual section, but if you were to use the term educator and not modify it in any way, these are the definitions that would apply.
Great. 204. Andrew, you're back up. So, we have 2.1 of 204 in front of us. And I think we have you in just to comment, express confidence where things have landed, whatever you would like on S204. And we have Ted Fisher in as well.
With apologies, Mr. Chair, the lead witness for this bill is myself.
Yep.
Today, because we're moving away from licensing into general literacy. So we don't have concerns with we have one potential caution with one of the provisions of section 1 on page 4. We're seeing we like the changes we've seen in terms of some of the concerns we had about clarifying the independent schools question I testified. I'm also available to speak as well to some of the questions about implementation that you had asked us to come back on.
Right, so we're gonna have to decide the public and independent school piece, but do you have any other concerns as it relates to this bill at this time?
The only thing to flag is, and it's highlighted in green on page 4, is sub G. So that's the only place where the term local literacy plan, and I'm phoning a friend and my colleague Emily Lesh, who I know spoke to you Friday. So I'm just gonna pull up what she's told me. The literacy plans, we've actually provided a local literacy plan template. We get clarifying questions from the field as to whether this is a requirement or not. I just did a quick search of the bill, and local literacy plan is only listed here. We're not sure if that means you're requiring it. Usually when you require things, you're a little bit more explicit about doing so. And that that was a question for ours. We don't necessarily recommend requiring a local literacy plan at this time.
What page?
This is 4G and it's highlighted in green. It looks like your printed version. The green is very dark. Apologies.
Yeah, and I think the committee also was a little confused. This is your original language, you know that, right? Or no, it's not. Is it recommended from Mr. Careless or is it, okay, so this is AOE's language that you're not supporting.
I am sorry, I was not aware it had been provided by a colleague.
So it says each local school district and approved independent school shall engage local stakeholders through the needs assessment and asset mapping process when developing a local literacy plan to improve reading proficiency. And frankly, I think we just need to understand what that would be. Do we know, Ms. St. James? Please go ahead.
That's St. James Office of Legislative Counsel. So this is highlighted in green because of the decision point.
Yeah,
No changes have been made since draft 1.1. Because we kind of skipped over the topic, we just flagged it as a decision point on whether or not you want to require any local engagement.
okay.
But I believe I pointed out that the local literacy plan, in addition to not being something that is required in statute right now, is a public school concept. And so for my advice to you is that page 4, line 14, the entire subsection G that's highlighted in green is just a policy decision for you all on whether or not you want to put in any language that talks about stakeholder engagement. And if you do, let's develop that concept. But that's why this is highlighted in green, is that we kind of flagged that this was something that may not work and needed further discussion.
And I guess I'm still slightly confused by what what this mapping and stakeholder stuff looks like exactly, and I'm looking to the agency. Gentlemen,
I mean, I'm not sure exactly in this context, but generally speaking, within the agency, what we'll do is kind of like advisory teams, right? We'll identify folks from the field, either licensed teachers, administrators, people within ed prep, experts in the field, and come in and for the most part, what we like to do, and especially like speaking for myself primarily, is really try to give them a lot of autonomy to guide the conversation and really get a good understanding of what, the best practice in the field would be. And then generate policy from that.
So applying that, because we're talking about the local level, we aren't opposed to the idea of a requirement for stakeholder engagement. As a matter of fact, parental notification is slightly different, but we've seen the language above. If you remember, we'd asked for some changes to the parental notification to make sure it's consistent with applicable law, state law, and federal legislative intent. That we appreciate that change. I don't think we have a concern with low stakeholder engagement necessarily. The question was just whether you were wanting to require the local literacy plan. It seems like Beth has flagged that as just a point about stakeholder engagement. Stakeholder engagement is something we're concerned about. If you wanted to have a requirement that schools undertake that as part of literacy efforts, you could potentially do more general language.
okay, so part of this kind of tricky position is you guys have been here, and over here, and you're here.
Yeah.
It's not helpful. It's just to be perfectly honest, I speak
Absolutely.
not YouTube, but we've had bills that have been drafted and redrafted at your recommendations, so it's clear and concise on the page, so you guys can all get. If we're coming over here, would be really helpful.
We actually appreciate your feedback on that, and it's certainly a major. Without going too much into detail, I learned two important things. One is we revamped our policy development process this year. There's been a lot of improvements, but some things have been rough. I also realized how important the month of July is for the legislative process, because almost everyone who does policy work in the agency was doing flood relief work at the statewide level, unfortunately. So we missed out on some of that important time. So I appreciate your committee's forbearance on that. The only other thing to just note, and Senator Kulik I'm sensitive to her thoughts earlier about the need to move deliberately while still moving quickly. One of the things you had asked us to just come back with some, we had flagged some concerns about implementation. I still do think a lot of this has to do with bears on schools, so it'd be worth maybe hearing from some of our school colleagues about how this would play out in the local level. But one of the couple of things that we're thinking about that could be helpful would be, for example, a later effective date for universal screeners under Section 2, so you could move the effective date back. One of the things is that the requirement in F on page 4, just so at that highlighted section, the highlighted sentence where it says the agency shall develop a plan for parental notification or part of this subsection consistent with applicable state and federal law and legislative intent. You're not explicitly giving us a deadline, but that effective date is, if I check the moment of memory serves, it's on passage. We won't be able to implement it on passage or on that July 1 timeframe. We could potentially do it for the fall. So you could give us I think I defer to that, but I think you would give us a session law section with a date, say of like November 1st or something like that, to come up with a parental notification plan. Some of those things that would give us a little bit of time and also give the field some time to react would be helpful. So you could potentially delay effectiveness of the section by a year or something like that if you were thinking about kind of some of those things. But other than that, and a concern about just generally hearing from the field on this, that's basically what we have to offer in terms of the implementation. We are noting in big lift, but it's worth doing to our conversation earlier.
And you mean hearing from the field specifically, we've heard from the V's, who else are you talking about?
If you've heard from the Bs and they haven't flagged concerns about this language,
They don't like it.
they don't.
No, I mean, I don't think the NEA, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Bannon, they had some concerns. Okay,
If you've heard from them and you've heard their concerns, then we're comfortable.
that's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
From our part, it's really just a question of we're big fans of effective dates now and how we are deliberative of that work, so.
Great. Anything else for Ted? Thanks,
Thank you.
really appreciate it. We're gonna shift to Holocaust education and we're gonna take though about 10 minutes until we have Miss St. James back as well as Linda Garces and Perry Handel to talk